an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, chapters 16 through 22, and a little bit of chapter 15. In these chapters, funny story, I read a little bit too far this time because I got a tiny bit wrapped up in the story and lost track of where I was supposed to stop. I guess I need the kind of bookmark that Rashawn got for Harry Potter, but in short, Nina can control the dead. The fuck is that about? What? Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Katelyn for commissioning this episode. Katelyn, I hope I'm saying your name right. I believe so. I am really, there's a lot to cover this time around because I just have to make up for missing a bit of the end of the previous episode in the previous, the previous chapter that I just talked too long and didn't get a chance to talk about. And also, I read too far this time. So I'm going to be packing a lot of plot in this section. So please all forgive me. But the thing that I've really wanted to do justice and actually talk about that I didn't get a chance to really get into last time was Matthias's wolf. Because we get the story of how he gets his wolf. And it's actually really touching. It turns out that there's kind of a ritual that all of the Driscoll have to go through when they get the wolf that is to be their comrade in arms. It's not a pet. This is a fellow soldier in a lot of ways. It turns out that the Grisha's powers don't work on animals. So having a wolf in the field with you is one of the only ways to defend yourself against them, which is pretty fucking rad in a lot of ways. And the reason that this comes up and he starts thinking about it, is her getting that suicide pill from one of the other Grisha. And he is really jarred by it because he has been having a strange recurring dream about Nina being kind of stuck in the middle of this storm, screaming for help, and that there are wolves around, but he is not actually able to help her. And the dreams started on the night when she was going through her worst bouts of withdrawal. The bit that's mentioned here is really tough. She'd been in a rage that night, body quaking, clothes soaked through with sweat. "You're not a good man," she shouted. "You're a good soldier. And the sad thing is you don't even know the difference." She'd been miserable later, weeping, sick with hunger, sick with regret. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean it. You know I didn't mean it." And a moment later, "If you would just help me." Her beautiful eyes were full of tears, and in the faint light from the lanterns, her pale skin had seemed gilded in frost. "Please, Matthias, I'm in so much pain. Help me." "I can't, my love. I can't get you more Purim. I had them lock the door from the outside." In a flash, her face changed. Her eyes slitted. "Then break the fucking door down, you useless skiv." "No." She spat in his face. So, yikes. I don't know how many of y'all have seen somebody going through withdrawal. I'm really lucky in that I never actually had to see it. I saw my dad, I didn't actually see the overdose. I saw him heading in that direction and him acting really weird. And then he was gone. My mom had kicked him out. but I didn't actually see him having to go through the withdrawal after he stopped using. And I am grateful for that, because this sort of thing is apparently very common in addicts, like the desperation and the genuine belief that you're gonna die if you don't get any. And there's a reason to feel that way. You might. Like, if you're trying to cut yourself off too hard, too fast, you can die from detoxing. So to distract herself, she asks him to tell her about Eisenulf. He shouldn't have been surprised she knew of the Eisenulf, the white wolves bred to go into battle with the Driscoll. They were bigger than ordinary wolves, and though they were trained to obey their masters, they never lost the wild, indomitable streak that separated them from their distant, domesticated cousins. So he explains to her that there's one family that breeds them, and every time there's a new litter, they travel this long-ass way, a bunch of the Driscoll together, to find if they're going to be accepted by one of them, because there's oftentimes not enough wolves to go around to each of them. Sometimes there's too many, but not always. And he is recalling how he found his. The way that it, like, he says, a Driscoll can train a new wolf, but it's a terrible loss if they lose theirs. What happens to the wolf if his Driscoll is killed? Matthias was silent for a time. He did not want to think about this. Trass had been the creature of his heart. They are returned to the wild, but they will never be accepted by any pack. And what was a wolf without a pack? The Eisenulf were not meant to live alone. So here he's realizing that when they thought he was dead, they turned his wolf out, and it had nowhere to go probably, so who knows what the hell happened to it. His name was Trassel, which means troublemaker. And he had been abused by some kids. When Matthias finds this wolf, he's separated from the others because he got sliced in the face with a broken bottle, and nobody wanted to take it because he was so bad-tempered. And Matthias is just feeling it. You know, he's just got this sense like, nope, this is the one. And I really like how this whole thing is underscored by how separate Matthias feels from everybody that is in his, I don't know what's the word I want. Precinct is for police. Well, everybody who is in the party that he's with anyway, heading up to find these wolves. It's really, you know, he's bigger than the rest of them. He is a very, very good soldier, but he isn't social the way that he needs to be if he wants to advance. And he just always seems sort of aloof and maybe even superior in a way that rubs some people the wrong way. But they leave him alone because he's so big. And this other wolf is separated from everybody in the same way and has been sort of like pushed around. And he just feels this kinship and lets the wolf out of the cage, even though the breeder is like, you don't want to do that. And the dog immediately sinks its teeth into his arm, but he doesn't fight back and he doesn't hit or reprimand or do anything. He just keeps eye contact. And eventually the wolf sort of calms down, and Matthias bandages up his arm and is like, this one's mine. And then he just passed out. Which is a pretty great story, to be honest. And this is when, like, after telling her this whole story, this is when he falls asleep and has this nightmare. And he tries to talk to her about her power changing. And she wants to know why he's being pushy about it. And he's like, well, if the shoe catch you, maybe they couldn't enslave you. He's trying to come up with reasons why she doesn't have to use the poison. And she's like, I don't know what it did to me. And I can't take that risk. I will not be used against my own people. I'm not doing that. And he asks her what she's feeling right now. And she says, you know, it's weird. The craving isn't really, I haven't thought about Parem since we fought at the tavern. And she realizes that she's hungry. And as they're leaving, feeling a little bit uplifted by the fact that she's showing some really good signs of coming out of this terrible, withdrawal that she has seemed to be in for a while, they pass by some posters and Matthias is on them. And he is illustrated down to a T. Like, it's very clearly him. And it turns out they don't even want him alive. They're dead or alive. Either way, they're offering 50,000 Kruge. So that is how that chapter ends. So I just wanted to make sure I went over all of that before I started on to the next section. So we go on to chapter 16, which is Jesper. And this is when it turns out they have been found out. We start off in a very relaxed conversation because none of them know what's happening yet. But they're all working on, Wylan is making some magnetized, wires for Inej to use on the silos and is working on all of that. When Nina and Matthias come back and report on what's going on, she starts chomping down crackers because she's actually starving still, I'm just really glad because I've been worried about her. I have theories on this. We'll get to that later. And there's this moment where Matthias finds out that Kaz is worth 100,000 Kruge, and he's really jealous in a way of the fact that Kaz is worth double what he is. A hint of a smile tugged at Kaz's lips. As the market wills it. Tell me about it, said Jesper. They're only offering 30,000 for me. And Wylan is just how can you guys be like this about it? Acting like you're offended when they're fucking trying to kill you. And then Nina is looking at Inej's poster and it's just maybe we should all just go to Ravka. And Inej looks at Kaz when he says it's not a terrible idea, and she's like, would you go? And he says, absolutely not. I want to watch this man's life fall apart, so I'm not going anywhere. And Nina's trying to convince Inej to go, and she's like, I'm not going unless I'm on a ship with my own people. That's the way this is happening. And Jesper as well says that he doesn't want to leave without his father getting the money that he deserves and going back home. It's very important to him that he get his father back to where he feels he belongs. And they're in the, let's see where it is. Oh yeah. They're talking about, because of the concerns over whatever these things are that are hunting Grisha, they have this coffee extract that has this strong smell, and they can use that to throw off, hopefully. They aren't positive because they've never tried it on these creatures before, but they're going to use it to try and throw off their scent so that they aren't able to detect them as easily. So this is when my suspicions from the previous episode were confirmed. It turns out that Kaz did know that Wylan's mother was still alive. And Jesper, I love this, Jesper felt a spike of rage. It was one thing for Kaz to mess with him, but Wylan wasn't like the rest of them. Despite the bad hand he'd drawn with his father, Wylan hadn't let his circumstances or the city knock the goodness out of him. He still believed people could do right. You shouldn't have sent him to St. Hild blind like that. It was cruel. It was necessary. Wylan's fists were clenched. Why? Because you still didn't understand what your father really is. You could have told me. You were angry. Angry wears off. I needed you righteous. Yeah. Also, dude, you could have told me is not going to get it across the same way. You need to see that shit. You're not going to listen to Kaz. I mean, if Kaz told you your mom was still alive, you just wouldn't believe it, right? I mean, come on. You had to see it. He was totally right about that. So he starts talking to all of them about how they're going to do this, this job. And we all pretty much know how these plans go. And after that, there was nothing to do but finish packing up their gear. So there's no grand goodbye. I like that. And as they're packing, Jesper and Wylan are talking about what their plans are after this. And Wylan is asking whether Jesper is planning on going back to Novia Zem. And there's this whole vibe of each of them clearly wanting to be with the other, but neither of them are really willing to be vulnerable and say that they want to be together. And neither of them are willing to give up on the plan that they have for their parent as well, that they're taking responsibility for. And Jesper's he's not even willing to say that he's got the plan for his dad, but other than that, he's not willing to commit to a plan at all. And Wylan's clearly disappointed that Jesper is not offering up himself to be, brought out to the countryside along with Wylan's mom. And Wylan finally just straight up asks Jesper, is this really what you want in life, to just go from one job to another like this and always be on the edge of dying? And Jesper finally has to be yeah, it is. And then, without thinking, Jesper reached out and untwisted the strap. He didn't let go. But it's not all that I want. Now, said Kaz, I'm going to beat him over the head with that cane. Yeah, come on. Kaz, don't cockblock like this. Let them have their moment, for Christ's sake. So, they head out. And let's see, Kuwei began reorganizing the notebooks in his pack. And Kuwei is asking a lot of questions about Ravka, and the fact that he's going with Nina and Matthias scares him a little because Matthias is pretty intimidating. He says he's very stern. What happened at the lake house? Jesper smoothed out the corner of one of the maps. I'm not sure, but I think she choked a guy to death with a cloud of dust. I don't understand it, said Matthias. A cloud of dust? She controlled shards of bone today. She could never have done that before Parem. She seems to think the change is temporary, a residual effect of the drug, but could the Parem alter Agrisha's power, change it, and destroy it? So then we get a bit of a flashback to Jesper figuring out exactly how this drug used to work when he was a kid. And we get to see what Jesper's mother was like, whom he adored. Because his father used to grow jurda. And they just couldn't quite make the farm make the money that it needed to. And he's thinking about what it was like growing up with a father who the first time that he ever used his power, he thought his father was angry at him because he'd used it to draw a swear word in the grass by draining all of the color out of the grass, which is a fascinating idea. But he realizes later that his dad is mad at him because he's worried about people knowing that he has this gift at all. And his mother doesn't want to be hidden. She is a lot more defiant. But his father is constantly worrying about his mother, and he sees the way that this affects their marriage and this constant pressure and concern. And of course, I'm waiting for his mother to be killed somehow by being found out to be Agrisha and somebody hunting her down. But it turns out that it's her actual ability that she misuses that is what kills her, because she extracts the poison from somebody's body and she internalizes it rather than managing to get it all out and just dissipate it into the air or something. She absorbs some of it and she winds up dying from it. And that makes a lot more sense to me why Jesper has been really hesitant to use his ability or get any training. It's a combination of the fear, I think, of knowing how Grisha are treated, but also having seen firsthand that this can kill you if you do things that you don't have the ability and experience to cope with. If you overstep yourself, you can really hurt yourself. And it's really touching, like all of the difference in the relationship that Jesper had with his father versus his mother, but that he's still close to both of them and loves both of them. It's just a really different connection because of the fact that she can do this stuff. And I really like this. Sometimes when they got home late and she needed to get supper on, she'd boil the water without ever heating the stove, make bread rise just by looking at it. He'd seen her pull stains from clothes with a brush of her fingers, and she made her own gunpowder, extracting the saltpeter from a long, dry lake bed near where they lived. I love all of this. Like, I have been, this is what you do when you read books like this. You low-key wonder to yourself, which of these powers, if I could choose, would I want to have? And I am not somebody who deals real well with, like, blood and all of that. So when I think about somebody who has the ability to deal with bodies, that's what I think of. But then there's Nina, and she can do stuff to alter appearance, which is a super awesome trick that I have always said being able to shapeshift and make yourself look like different people would be super fun, because you could make yourself look like whomever you felt like that day. Your moods would be different people, and that would be fun. But when I saw how practical being a fabricator could be, the idea of just being able to lift stains out of clothes right there would make my life like 80% fucking simpler. Y'all don't even know, when you have big tits like mine, how stained all your clothes get from when you're eating. If anything drops, there's a shelf right beneath you and it's gonna get on you. It's such a fucking headache. So when I read that, I was like, oh my God, that is awesome. I never even thought about that. And I'm sorry, guys, do you hear this? I don't know what just drove by, but it's like a friggin' tank. His father, once she dies, is just really having a hard time. And Jesper is trying so hard to, take care of his dad and make sure that he's okay. They'd taken her back to the farm and buried her beneath a cherry tree that was already beginning to flower. To Jesper, it had seemed too pretty for such a sad day, and even now, seeing those pale pink flowers in a shop window or embroidered on a lady's silks always put him in a melancholy mind. They took him back to the smell of fresh-turned earth, the wind whispering through the fields, his father's trembling baritone singing a lonely kind of song, a Kalish air in words Jesper didn't understand. Jesper made dinner for them that night, burnt biscuits and watery soup, but his father ate every bite and read to him from his Kalish book of saints until the lights burned low and the pain in Jesper's heart eased enough for him to sleep. And that was the way it had been from then on, the two of them looking after each other, working the fields, bundling and drying Jorda in the summers, trying to make the farm pay. Why hadn't it been enough? But even as Jesper had the thought, he knew it could never be enough. He could never go back to that life. He hadn't been built for it. Maybe if his mother had lived, she would have taught him to channel his restlessness. Maybe she would have shown him how to use his power instead of hiding it. Maybe she'd have gone to Ravka to be a soldier for the crown. Or maybe he would have ended up right here anyway. So this is when he mentions that the Zemeni used the stalks. And the Jorda blossoms, which everybody uses, most of them all throw the stalks away and think that the blossoms are the only worthwhile thing. But she used to soak the stalks in goat's milk, and he would, because he was like a child working on this farm, he'd be inhaling Jorda pollen all day. So drinking this mixture from the stalks it formed a kind of balm, and it would calm him back down because it's a stimulant, And he says the Zemeni drain it for ointments. They rub it on babies' gums and nostrils when they're burning Jorda. And then all of a sudden he starts to realize the full implication of what he's saying. And it's like, wait a minute. What if they can counteract Jorda Parem using the stalks? And he's in the middle of this thought when they get interrupted, because somebody is here. And that's the end of part 3. We don't find out who it is until the next chapter, or not even the next chapter. I think it's maybe the very end of it, because the next chapter is Inej, and she's in the middle of her high wire act between the silos. And there is a lot going on here, guys. So Inej is on this, like, doing this, first of all, she has her, like, intro moment with Nina, because Nina has to distract one of the guards and give Inej the opportunity to slip inside the area in the first place and then scale the side of one of these silos to the top. And he is very easy to manipulate, this guard. Like, he's totally enraptured with her very, very quickly. So it's an easy job getting started. And this is the thing. It's a little bit too easy, right? So they head up there, and Inej is, like, walking the wire, thinking about how she got trained to do this and the way that she just had a gift and was so fearless, and still kind of is in this way that just never gone away. There's something innate in her that makes her really good at this. And she is fantasizing about the money and being able to escape from this fucking place. And she drops the weevil into the silo before getting onto the wire to head into the next one. And as she is crossing the wire, the smell of the burning sugar from this weevil being inserted brings up a memory. She basically has a PTSD flashback in the middle of the wire. Bad scene. She is not ready for it at all. And I find this to be really a great illustration of how this goes down, because it's the kind of thing that, and I am not somebody who has any PTSD that I know of, where I've had to deal with this sort of thing. The closest I can come to describing how I understand this is the feeling of deep grief that comes when you lose somebody who was a huge part of your life. And this is something that is true of my father and my grandmother. The memory that comes to you out of nowhere and catches you totally off guard is the sort of thing that you can't really get across to people who haven't experienced it. It's weird because if you've lost someone and you're going, say, to their house to clean things out, you go in there braced, knowing you are going to be in their territory, you are going to see their things, you are going to see photos. And so emotionally, you have prepared yourself for something that's going to be painful and difficult. And you know this is coming, and it makes all the difference. But it's when you are suddenly, and this moment being triggered by a smell is perfect example. Because that is what can do it. Something as simple as the scent, like, coming at you that is exactly the smell that was in this room when something happened. For me, my grandmother lived in a really rundown house. And we all were baffled that she didn't just sell it and move because the property was valuable. But we came to find out afterwards that she had taken out a bunch of liens against the house in order to be able to live, which we didn't know about. And the house was decaying, and there was a really strong smell of mildew a lot of the time. However, my grandmother baked a ton, so she would have this scent of cinnamon in the air often when I would come over. And I will never forget, I was in the middle of baking cinnamon rolls for Christmas at this house here in Texas, and I opened the cupboard under the sink, and there had been a leak, and there was a strong smell of mildew when I opened the cupboard, but behind me, the oven door was open and the smell of cinnamon was coming out. And I had to stop and just start crying because the smell of the two things was exactly grandma, you know? And it was like, if you had asked me what smells I associated with her, these are not the ones that I would have been like, this is the thing at all. It's a completely unconscious association that you make. And it's just one of those startling things where you're like, tears are coming up in your eyes and you're like, what is happening? Because you're not even, it's like your body responds before your brain even has a chance to catch up. And this moment of her like suddenly smelling the sugar, and all of a sudden she's at the menagerie and she is remembering a hand grasping her wrist. And you know that this is about her being raped, but when you find out exactly how this went down, it's so different than what you think. Because she's talking or thinking about how her being brought to the menagerie and how she was initially taught to cope with being raped repeatedly. She was taught that she had to basically disengage from her body and play a part and be outside of her body and not like let herself actually feel or experience what was happening to her because it would be too much. Disassociation is a really common, what's the word I want? Phenomenon, I guess, in situations where people are being physically abused or raped or threatened or, you know, there's just, this is something that our brain does for us to help. And Inej learns how to consciously do that to herself to help. But there is a man, and you're waiting because it says like he was the worst, and you're waiting for him to be incredibly abusive, you know, to beat her up or be cruel in some way. Instead, he remembers her from her high wire act as a child. And this man reminding her of where she comes from, of her family, talking very specifically about the act that she did, about the rose headdress she wore. All of this makes her unable to leave her body when she has to. He has reminded her so strongly of who she is and where she comes from and who her people are and what she has lost, that it's the first time in ages that she isn't able to escape while this is happening to her. And so it is an incredibly traumatic moment. And it is just, it's so beautifully written and so heart-wrenching and so real. And she has to really stop and catch her breath and refocus. And as she's doing so, she's remembering what she said to Kaz about how she wants to have him without his armor. And then she's thinking, what if he had tried to kiss me? What if he had tried to pull me towards him? And this is when you realize as a reader, she was a child when she was captured and probably virgin. And likely the only sexual contact she has ever had in her life has been being raped at a brothel. So what if Kaz had responded to her? What if it triggered something terrible and she couldn't be with him the way that she wants to because she just has this horrific association and trauma, and she doesn't honestly know how she'd have reacted. She can't tell because it's so unpredictable, you know, and there might be times where it would be okay and then times where it would not be okay. And how do you know that's coming until it's too late? And having to live with that and knowing that you might never be able to have that kind of relationship in a normal way like other people can. And whether or not the person you're with is going to have the patience for that and be okay and understand. And that is really rough. So just as she is like getting her feet back under her, there is somebody behind her who shoves her off the wire. And that chapter ends, and we go to Kaz. And Kaz is sneaking in with Wylan to Van Eck's study to steal this seal. And he knows this shit is going too smoothly, but he can't back out. The whole thing is like resting on this. So they have to proceed, but he has this fucking feel that there is something wrong with this situation. And they manage to get through everything, and he's talking to Wylan. And he says, let's see. Oh, he's talking to the safe. He says, "Look at you." And they pour the contents of the jar that Wylan has into it, or this little pipette, actually. And they can hear this crackling as it eats it apart, basically. Pick up the pace, Kaz said, eyeing his watch. "If I spill a single drop of this, it will burn straight through the floor onto my father's dinner guests." And then Kaz says, "Take your time," which I really appreciated. So he takes the seal. He takes a couple stacks of Kruger, and he is handing them over to Wylan. And Wylan is still not really feeling like copacetic with this whole situation. He knows, like Jesper said to him at one point, that this is this is his own money that he's taking back. But Wylan still has a really hard time getting around the actual way the laws work. As far as Kaz is concerned, you're his son, and whether he chose to disinherit you or not, you're still entitled. He doesn't get to do that. But Wylan is like, no, the law says he can. He wrote his will. I'm not in it, and that's the way it is. But he's able to look past it for the sake of his mother. And Wylan is asking Kaz about whether or not Kaz has someone in his life that he would trust with a secret that could destroy him. And Kaz immediately is like, yup, but in his head. He doesn't say it. He thinks it to himself. And Kaz says, when people see a cripple walking down the street, what do they feel? Wylan looked away. People always did when Kaz talked about his limp, as if they didn't know what he was or how the world saw him. They feel pity. Now, what do you think they think when they see me coming? Wylan's mouth quirked up at the corner. They think they'd better cross the street. Kaz tossed the ledger back in the safe. You're not weak because you can't read. You're weak because you're afraid of people seeing your weakness. You're letting shame decide who you are. Think of it. It's shame that lines my pockets. Shame that keeps the barrel teeming with fools ready to put on a mask just so they can have what they want with no one the wiser for it. We can endure all kinds of pain. It's shame that eats men whole. And this is when fucking Pekka Rollins says wise words. And all of a sudden, he is here and is like, hey, bitch, bet you thought you'd seen the last of me. Oh, this sucks. And basically, this whole section is the camera, for lack of better terms, jumping from one character to another as they each realize that they are totally fucked. So when we go to chapter 19, Matthias is experiencing the second wave that's, I would say probably Pekka Rollins is like number 2 guy with his whole crew. And they want, what's his face? Kuwait. And they're under orders to take Kuwait alive. So that's the only reason that they haven't just like come in there and wreaked holy hell over them, because they need to make sure that he isn't hurt in the skirmish. Well, what Matthias decides to do, because they've smashed all the boats, so there isn't any way that they're going to like dodge around these dudes and then be able to just jump in a boat and sail off. Matthias like reaches inside for the military training that he had, which requires you to make use of whatever is at your disposal. And the one thing that they have that is an asset is that these two are both Grisha, and none of the guys out there know it. So there's a bunch of other stuff that they've got, like some, flash bombs and little things like this, but they hadn't been expected to be ambushed on the island. So a lot of stuff hasn't been left here. So Matthias, he's like, takes control of the situation. And Jesper, who doesn't really like Matthias, is just sort of putting up a fight about everything. And finally, Matthias has to be like, dude, you can either listen or you can go out there and deal with them by yourself. But I don't have time to explain fucking everything to you. So follow orders or go die is basically your two options. So he lights one of the flash bombs and says, as soon as it goes up, Kuwei, I want you to get to the front door as fast as you can and run. I'll be right behind you, and I'll be leaving cover for you. Go to the tomb with the broken mast and head straight for it. Jesper, grab up all the powders that Wylan left here and do the same. And they do it and head out there, and when they get to the other tomb, he asks Jesper, okay, do you have the powders? What was left of them, said Jesper. Can you manipulate those powders? Jesper shifted uneasily. Yes, I guess. I did something similar at the ice court. Why? 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 In the Driscoll, he would have been brigged for insubordination. Black Veil is supposedly haunted, yes? We're going to make some ghosts. I need you to follow my orders and stop asking questions, both of you. So he opens the packet, and the powder, Jesper manipulates it and lifts it into the air and raises it out and suspends it in the air. And then he says to Kuwei, who is an Inferni, to cast his flame at it. The flame from the green torch crept along the handle, snaking up the arm of its bearer in a sinuous coil of fire. So this is around a dude. And the flame catches and cannot be put out. This magical flame it's like napalm, you know? But Kuwei loses his nerve for a second, and it does go out, and Matthias has to stay on him to start it over again. Kuwei thrust his hands out again, and one of the Dime Lion's lanterns exploded in a whirl of yellow flame. So they keep on doing this, and they keep on sort of distracting them with these weird figures of flame and powder and whatnot. And finally, Matthias says, all right, we're going to spread the fire to the trees. We're going this way. And then we head to the shore. And when they get down there, he goes to what he knows, because of how many times they've been back and forth to this island, is the shallowest area. And he commands Kuwei to make a path. He's not even positive at this point that Kuwei has the ability to do this, because it would take a pretty good amount of power. And he manages it. Kuwei uses his flames to send up a huge plume of steam by boiling away the water that's on top of this sandbar and exposing it so that they can just run over it. You do realize you just led your own little Grisha army, said Jesper, as they hauled themselves out of the mud. He had an uncomfortable thought. Through Jesper and Kuwei, he had wielded Grisha power, and yet Matthias did not feel tainted or somehow marked by it. So then he starts to think about what he's been taught and realizes, what if this hatred that's been bred in me and my people isn't from fear or anger? What if it's just envy? What if they're just jealous because they feel like their God bestowed the gifts they should have on some other people that don't deserve it? And that's all it is. And I love this, because there is nothing quite like the moment, as somebody who has been indoctrinated as much as anyone, there's nothing quite like the moment when you start to ask those kinds of questions and be like, oh shit, there's not some huge movement or logic behind this. This is personal, private weakness that makes people say and think these things. They have masked it in this nobility, but it just comes from a profoundly greedy or insecure place. And that is some heady shit when you start to realize that sort of thing. It is just, and it's even worse when you start to realize it, but you can see that other people around you haven't quite got there yet. And it's just, it gets really tiring. Once it becomes so clear, there's no denying that all the pieces fit together when you see it that way, in a way they never fit together before. But then there are still people around you that are catching up and not really getting it. And even people that you thought got it, who wind up taking several steps back. And you have to decide whether you're willing to keep people in your life that are okay with that or not. And I've really gotten to a place in my life where I won't do that anymore. I'm not going to keep those people around. You can give folks a lot of chances, and it's up to them to take those chances. And, there comes a point where after you have talked to somebody a couple of times about their behavior, if they keep doubling down on it or allowing people to behave that way around them and not, reprimand them and cut them out, you have to assume that they aren't interested in growing in the way that you want to grow. And if your priorities in that are not aligned, staying friends is not really something that is possible or something that you even want anymore. And I have experienced that a few times over the past couple of years. And it's a really hard thing to watch. And it's just, I'm already feeling for him because he is already cut off from everybody. But he has had it in his head so much of the time that if he got home, he could just go back to at least living in his country, even if he couldn't be a Druscale, even if there was going to be shame associated with it. But now going back is out of the question. There's just, even if he weren't wanted the way that he is, it's just his whole family and all of his people are still caught up in this belief system that he's coming to realize is complete horseshit. So anyway, we go back to Inej, and it turns out that this bitch didn't shove her off the wire. She just pushed her off balance. She's just trying to mess with her. Her legs found purchase on the silo roof, and she yanked herself free. She rocked back on her heels, knives already released from their sheaths. Her mind could not quite make sense out of what she was seeing. A girl stood before her on the silo roof, gleaming like a figure carved of ivory and amber. Her tunic and trousers were the color of cream, banded in ivory leather and embroidered in gold. Her auburn hair hung in a thick braid laced with the glint of jewels. She was tall and slender, maybe a year or two older than Inej. So this girl, Danyasha, as she says, the white blade, trained by the sages of Amrat Jen, the greatest assassin of this age. She has this whole thing, and Inej is just doesn't ring a bell. And she says, I am new to this city, but I'm told you are a legend on these filthy streets. And this starts off their fight. But Danyasha is better than Inej. She's a better fighter, and she's also not completely exhausted by having endured what Inej has endured over the past couple of weeks. So she hasn't got all of these, bumps and bruises and strains and cuts and everything that Inej is coping with. And she is pretty much whooping Inej's ass. And she has these throwing stars in addition to her own knives that she's hitting her with in the fucking shoulder, in the shin at one point, which that's particularly nasty. And it's kind of hard to read. And as she's doing this, she's fucking chatting with Inej about how she is the emissary of death, that she fears nothing, that death is a beautiful thing to bring, and that she is proud to be the bearer of it for people. This is a religious thing for her. She calls it holy. And our work is death, and it is holy. And Inej, being somebody who is religious, fucking is a little bit shook by this. She just doesn't, it's not the sort of thing that you can just, if it were me, sort of let roll off your back, well, you're crazy. Inej is really kind of who is this girl's God? What is this? And when she looked back, Danyasha was no longer on the wire. Inej saw her bend, saw her hand reach for the magnet. "No. Protect me," she whispered to her saints. The line went slack. Inej fell, twisting in the air the way she had as a child, searching for her wings. And that's the end of that chapter. And we go back to Kaz. And he's looking at fucking Pekka Rollins and trying to keep the absolute sheer combo of rage and panic at bay that he always feels when he sees this fucking guy. And I'm going to really sum this up as quickly as I can because I want to talk about Nina for these last 10 minutes. But what it boils down to is that Pekka is working for Van Eck. And he'd known that was a possibility. But he really thought that if they got through fast enough and got all of this shit working with the sugar and everything, they wouldn't have been able to form this alliance so quickly. But he was wrong. The little stunt you pulled with his wife drove him right into my loving arms. I told Van Eck you'd always be a step ahead of him, because he can't help thinking like a businessman. He's a savvy one, but a man of limited imagination, whereas you think like a villainous little thug. And essentially, Rollins is just fucking monologuing for this whole thing about how Kaz takes things too personally, he holds a grudge, he doesn't know when to let shit go, and that leads to him making mistakes because he gets too wrapped up in whether something is just or fair. And Kaz finally uses the acid that was used to burn through that lock, and he pours it on the ground and turns it into, because he says, if one door closes, you have to make a new one. The floor burns out from underneath them and smashes through, and they go right through the floor and land on a fucking table where everybody is having dinner. And I love this so much. He had a brief moment to register the startled expressions of the merchers around the table. Then Van Eck was screaming, "Seize them!" And Kaz and Wylan were leaping over a fallen ham and sprinting down the black and white tiled hall. And he basically does a baseball slide to get past them out into the yard. Wylan actually manages as well. I don't even think that's described, but I'll trust it. A bullet pinged into the side of the boat as gunfire peppered the water around them. He and Roddy seized their oars. "Drop heavy," Kaz shouted, and Wylan let loose with every rocket, flash bomb, and bit of demo he'd been able to fit into the boat. The sky above the Van Eck house exploded in an array of light, smoke, and sound as the guards dove for cover. "In and out without him ever knowing," said Roddy. "I was half right," growled Kaz. And this is when Roddy hears that Pekka Rollins is there, and he gets a little bit flipped out by it, because Pekka Rollins is just kind of a legend, even more so than Kaz. He's been around longer. And Kaz is really not liking the fact that people are having this response to the guy. Meanwhile, they're talking about going back to Black Veil, but Kaz feels like that's a bad idea. He seems to have an inkling that if they caught him up here, they're definitely going to know where they're at there, So, and he says, "Why had I sent them to the silos alone? Nina and her precious refugees. There would be no grand rescue for the Grisha tonight. All their chances were shot to hell. To hell with revenge. To hell with his schemes. If Rollins had done something to Inej, Kaz would paint each stave with his entrails." Woo! That is a good one. I like that one. And he's just really struggling with the fact that he feels like he's failed everybody, Inej especially, and for all he knows, she's fucking dead already. He's really bugging out a little bit. Meanwhile, Wylan is being useless. He's like, "We're not going to Vale. We're going to Sweet Reef. You said we'd be safe on Black Veil. You said there is no safe," Kaz snarled. "Not in the barrel, not anywhere." "What do we do now?" "Pick up a pair of oars and make yourself useful, or I'll put your pampered ass in the drink and let your father fish you out." And that's the end of that chapter. So now we go to Nina. Nina can see that there's some shit going on with Inej. And she is trying to distract the guards as this fight is going on. But it turns out that there are a lot more of them than she expected. Heard there was a heart-render hiding out in Sweet Reef, said the boy in the checked waistcoat, still swinging that chain. Oh, saints, that's bad. Had the Dime Lions followed her and Inej from Black Veil? Were the others in trouble? What if Pekka Rollins and his gang knew about the Grisha at the embassy? Some of them were violating their indentures by trying to leave the city. They could be blackmailed. Or worse, Pekka could sell them to the shoe. You have your own problems right now, Zenek, said a voice in her head. Stop worrying about saving the world and save your own ass. Sometimes her inner voice could be very wise. I really, really like that. So these guys are all starting to circle her, and she realizes they all have the red seal on them, that these dudes are with Van Eck. There was no way the guards would risk opening the gate for anyone their employer hadn't sanctioned. The implications made her head spin. Could Jan Van Eck and Pekka Rollins be working together? If so, the Dreg's chances of getting out of the city alive had just turned to crumbs on a cake plate. So here comes a standoff where they are aware that she is a heartrender, and she sort of overstates what she can do to intimidate them, but they become rapidly aware that she isn't actually able to do what she says. And they try her. Meanwhile, she's watching Inej in this fight and is starting to realize that things are not going well for Inej. She's keeping her balance, but you can tell that she's weak and unsteady and something is going on. And Nina knows that the net is there, and she's thinking about how if she had Parem, she could force all of these men surrounding her to grab this fucking net and hold it out and save Inej. But because she doesn't have it, she can't do anything. So she starts to reach out just wildly in every direction to try and find something that she can lash onto. And she finds it. The sick boat that they had been noticing earlier that is piled with corpses. The same sick boat that caused Kaz to never be able to deal with the feel of human flesh on his. And as she reaches out, she pulls them up and into action. And this is so wild. Nina was conscious of hands on her, chains being lashed around her wrists, but the cold was deeper now, a fast-flowing winter river, black rapids jagged with broken ice. The hands on her loosened, the chains hit the cobblestones, and Nina drew her arms toward her, plunging further into the cold of the river. "What the hell?" said Eamon, turning towards the guardhouse. "What the hell?" Nina could see a line of people pushing on the fence and rocking it on its posts. Some were old, some were young, but all of them were beautiful. Cheeks flushed, lips rosy, hair bright with shine and moving in waves around their faces with the gentle sway of something that grew underwater. They were lovely, and yet they were horrible. Because while some of them bore no signs of injury, one had brown blood and vomit splashed all over her dress. Another bore a puncture wound gone black with decay. So this is wild. They're basically zombies, but they look fresh and healthy and alive. It's just their clothing and their bodies that give away that they're dead. But if you looked at their faces, unless the injuries are on their faces, you wouldn't be able to tell. And she uses these dead to go grab the fucking net and hold it open so that Inej is saved. And this whole thing is just so wild. Meanwhile, fucking Danyasha, is that her name? I forgot it again. she decides to withdraw because she can see that all of these, quote, people, the dead around her, are really going to outnumber her, and there's no way that they can continue this fight tonight. Danyasha, that's right. And I love Inej. She says she really wants to kill me. Possibly everyone. Which, you know what? Fair. Does seem that way. And Inej is looking around and she's like, these people are dead. Did you use Parem? And she's like, nope, I don't know what this is. And Nina thinks back to when she was being taught how to use her powers and how she was taught that they are tied to the power of life and creation. So what I think happened is that the Parem reversed that. And she is actually tied to death now, somehow. Because the bones that she was able to grasp before, those were dead. And the dust that she choked that one guy with, dust is often made from dead things. Dead skin, dead hair, bone, like ground bone, whatever. I'm thinking that might be what's going on. And she's also she reflects on the fact that it says that's why using our gift makes us stronger instead of depleting us. We are tied to the power of creation. And I'm thinking that's why her health and her appetite is starting to come back, because this is the third time now that she's finally been able to latch onto a power of some kind and use it. And it's the reverse of what her power used to be, but it has the same effect on her body, I think. And I love that she says something about how terrible they smell. And Inej is like, hey, what if they can hear you? Oh, Inej, you're so sensitive. I love you. So finally, she releases them. She says, go and be at rest. They moved again, a sudden flurry that brought a prayer to Inej's lips. And they're trying to figure out where they're going to go. Black Veil is compromised. They're pretty sure. And they're in the middle of deciding what they're going to do and what to do about the Grisha as well. So they just head back to their boat, even though they don't really have a plan yet. And as they're standing there next to the boat, they see Kaz and Wylan heading toward them. And Inej whispers to herself, we'll fight our way out together. Nina glanced from Inej to Kaz and saw they both wore the same expression. Nina knew that look. It came after the shipwreck when the tide moved against you and the sky had gone dark. It was the first sight of land, the hope of shelter, and even salvation that might await you on a distant shore. And that is the end of the chapter, is her realizing that Inej is in love with Kaz. And I wonder if that's going to change anything for her. I have to think it will, but I don't know if she'll tell anybody. She'll probably tell Matthias. I wonder I feel like that would raise Kaz in Matthias's opinion, because he thinks that Kaz is a demon and capable of human emotion. But yeah. So that's wild. And I'm really excited that she's figuring out how to use this other power and that she's finally feeling better. And this is a really weird, change, I'm very interested to see how this develops. So, all right. Yeah. So again, thank you to Katelyn for commissioning this. These are really good chapters. My apologies for overreading and having to cover some of previous chapters to make up for it. But I actually talked about everything that I wanted and managed to fit it into the hour. So I'm really glad. So yeah, thank you guys all so much. And I really appreciate you all. And I hope you've been enjoying the coverage. And I will be seeing you again soon with a new episode. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.